there is a conversation that has been happening for 2,000 years, and that neither side has ever fully won. On one side, the claim that Jesus of Nazareth was the fulfillment of everything the Hebrew prophets promised, that the messianic prophecies of Isaiah and Daniel and Micah and Zechariah point with a precision that becomes visible only in retrospect to a specific person who lived in first century Judea, was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and rose from the dead on the third day, that the Jewish people who rejected this claim missed the fulfillment of their own tradition, that the greatest tragedy in religious history is that the people who had been waiting longest for the Messiah failed to recognize him when he came. On the other side, a response that is 2,000 years old and that most Christians have never heard in its full form, not because Jewish thinkers have been unable to articulate it, but because for most of Western history, the conditions for an honest theological dialogue between Judaism and Christianity did not exist. For most of Western history, the Jewish community lived under Christian political power, and disagreeing with Christian theological claims carried consequences that ranged from social marginalization to forced conversion to death. The Jewish response to Christian messianic claims was developed in conditions of extraordinary pressure and danger, and it has rarely been heard by Christian audiences with the seriousness it deserves. That response, when you hear it in its full form, is not what most Christians expect. It is not primarily an argument about miracles or resurrection or the nature of God. It is an argument about the text, about what the Hebrew prophets actually said in Hebrew before those texts were translated into Greek and then into Latin and then into English and accumulated 2,000 years of Christian interpretive overlay. It is an argument about what the word Messiah actually meant in the Hebrew tradition before Christian theology gave it a meaning that the original tradition did not contain. And it is an argument that whether or not you find it ultimately persuasive is considerably more sophisticated, more textually grounded, and more historically serious than the dismissive summary most Christians have been given. This video is not going to tell you who is right. It is going to tell you what the Jewish arguments actually are in their strongest form, with the textual evidence they rest on. Because 2,000 years of one of the most important theological conversations in human history deserves better than a caricature. Welcome to this channel where ancient secrets meet modern questions. Before we go into the 9 reasons, we need to establish something that the popular presentation of this question almost always glosses over: what the Jewish tradition actually expected the Messiah to do. Because the Christian claim is that Jesus fulfilled the messianic prophecies. The Jewish response is that he did not fulfill the specific things the Messiah was supposed to do. And to evaluate that response, you need to know what the Messiah was supposed to do. In the Hebrew Bible, the word Mashiach, anointed one, is applied to priests, kings, and prophets who are anointed for their roles. The term does not, in the Hebrew Bible itself, refer to a single specific future figure who will bring history to its culmination. The concept of a specific messianic figure who will appear at the end of history and transform the world is a development of the Second Temple period, elaborated in texts like the Psalms of Solomon, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the rabbinic literature. By the time the rabbinic tradition had fully articulated the concept, the Messiah was expected to do specific, concrete, observable things in the physical world. The Talmud and the subsequent rabbinic literature are remarkably clear about what these things are. The Messiah will gather all the Jewish people from the diaspora and bring them back to the land of Israel. The Messiah will rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. The Messiah will bring all the nations of the world to acknowledge the God of Israel. The Messiah will establish an era of universal peace in which war no longer exists, in which the wolf lies down with the lamb, in which every human being lives without fear. The Messiah will be a human being, a descendant of King David, who accomplishes these things through natural historical means, not through supernatural intervention. These are not vague spiritual metaphors in the rabbinic tradition. They are specific physical observable criteria. Either the temple has been rebuilt or it has not. Either the Jewish people have been gathered from the diaspora or they have not. Either universal peace has been established or it has not. These things can be checked, and the mainstream Jewish tradition has checked them against the life and death of Jesus of Nazareth and reached a straightforward historical conclusion. These things did not happen, therefore, Jesus was not the Messiah. This is the foundation of the Jewish rejection, and it is, on its own terms, a simple and powerful argument. Let us go through the 9 specific reasons in detail. The first reason is what is perhaps the most fundamental objection and the one that the Jewish tradition has pressed most consistently. The Messiah is supposed to bring world peace, and Jesus did not. Isaiah 2-4 is one of the most famous passages in the entire Hebrew Bible. He shall judge between the nations and shall arbitrate for many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. Isaiah 11 describes an era in which the wolf shall live with the lamb and the leopard shall lie down with the kid, in which the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Micah 4 contains a parallel to Isaiah 2, adding that every man shall sit under his own vine and under his own fig tree, and none shall make them afraid. These are the prophetic descriptions of the messianic era, and the Jewish tradition reads them as straightforward predictions of a transformed physical world, not a transformed spiritual world, not a changed relationship between the individual soul and God, but an actual geopolitical transformation in which war ceases and every human being lives without fear. The world after Jesus did not look like this. The world after Jesus included the Roman destruction of Jerusalem, the Jewish-Roman wars, 3 centuries of Christian persecution, the Crusades, the Inquisition, 2 world wars, and every other catastrophe of the past 2 millennia. Whatever Jesus accomplished, he did not bring world peace. And the Jewish tradition holds that the Messiah who does not bring world peace has not fulfilled the primary messianic task. The Christian response to this objection is well known. Jesus came the first time to accomplish the spiritual work of atonement, and he will come a second time to accomplish the physical transformation of the world. The Jewish tradition finds this response unsatisfying on textual grounds. The Hebrew prophets do not describe 2 comings of the Messiah. The concept of a first and second coming is not in the text. It is an interpretive addition that the Christian tradition developed to explain why the Messiah who had supposedly come had not done the things the Messiah was supposed to do. The Jewish philosopher and medieval commentator Maimonides, in his Mishneh Torah, states this position with characteristic clarity. He writes that if a king arises from the house of David who studies Torah and occupies himself with commandments like his ancestor David and compels all Israel to walk in its ways and repair its breaches and fights the battles of God, it may be assumed that he is the Messiah. If he succeeds in doing this and builds the temple in its place and gathers the dispersed of Israel, then he is definitely the Messiah. But if he did not succeed in doing this or was killed, he is not the Messiah spoken of in the Torah. Maimonides is not writing polemically against Christianity. He is articulating the internal logic of the Jewish messianic expectation as he understands it from the prophetic texts. And his conclusion is direct. A Messiah who was killed without accomplishing the tasks did not accomplish the tasks. Whatever Jesus was, he was not, by these criteria, the Messiah. The second reason is the rebuilding of the temple. The temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE, approximately 40 years after the crucifixion. The Jewish tradition holds that the rebuilt temple is a central component of the Messianic era, described in Ezekiel chapters 40-48 in extraordinary architectural detail. The Messiah will oversee the rebuilding of the temple. The temple has not been rebuilt. The site where it stood is currently occupied by the Dome of the Rock. Jesus did not rebuild the temple. He predicted its destruction, which occurred after his death, and his followers subsequently developed a theology in which the temple was no longer necessary because Jesus himself had replaced its function. The Jewish tradition finds this theological substitution problematic on textual grounds. The detailed architectural specifications for the Third Temple in Ezekiel are not the kind of language that naturally yields a spiritual or allegorical interpretation. Ezekiel gives measurements. He describes specific chambers and courts and dimensions with the precision of a building manual. The rabbinic tradition reads these chapters as a literal blueprint for a literal temple that will be literally built. A messianic claim that requires these chapters to be interpreted as metaphor is, from within the Jewish interpretive framework, doing something to the text that the text does not invite. The third reason is the ingathering of the Jewish exiles. Isaiah 11:12 describes the Messiah gathering the dispersed of Israel from the four corners of the earth. Ezekiel 37 describes the dry bones coming together as a vision of the restoration of the entire people of Israel to their land. Deuteronomy 30 promises that after exile, God will bring the people back to the land. The ingathering of the exiles is one of the most consistently described elements of the Messianic era across the prophetic literature. When Jesus lived, the Jewish people were already in a state of partial diaspora following the Babylonian exile and the subsequent period of Persian, Greek, and Roman rule. After his death, the situation became dramatically worse, with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple driving the majority of the Jewish population out of the land entirely. The ingathering of the exiles did not happen. The opposite happened. The Christian response has again been to place this fulfillment in the second coming. The Jewish objection remains that the prophetic texts describe no such two-stage process. The fourth reason is one of the most textually precise and most rarely discussed in popular presentations of this question. It concerns the specific messianic prophecy in Micah 5-2, the text that the Gospel of Matthew cites as predicting that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times. The Jewish objection to this citation is not about whether Jesus was born in Bethlehem, though the historical question of where exactly Jesus was born is itself debated by scholars. The Jewish objection is about what the text actually says when read in Hebrew. The word translated as ruler, mashal, refers to a political ruler, a governor, someone who exercises actual political authority over the people of Israel. The text is predicting a king, not a spiritual teacher, and Jesus did not rule over Israel in any political sense. He was executed by the Roman state as a criminal. A Roman governor's prisoner is not the ruler described in Micah 5. The fifth reason concerns the prophecy in Isaiah 53, the suffering servant passage, which is the most important single text in the Christian understanding of Jesus' death as fulfillment of prophecy, and the most contested text in the Jewish-Christian dialogue. Isaiah 53 describes a figure who is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, who was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities, upon whom was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with whose stripes we are healed. This passage has been read by Christians since the earliest period as a prediction of Jesus' death and its atoning significance. The Jewish tradition has a completely different reading, one that is older in some of its elements than the Christian reading, though both readings developed in the same period. In the traditional Jewish interpretation, the suffering servant of Isaiah 53 is not an individual future Messiah, but the people of Israel collectively, the nation that has suffered throughout history at the hands of Gentile nations and whose suffering has had redemptive significance for the world. This reading is not a desperate attempt to explain away an inconvenient text. It is grounded in the context of the surrounding chapters of Isaiah, in which the servant is explicitly identified multiple times as Israel. Isaiah 41:8. But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, the offspring of Abraham, my friend. Isaiah 44:1. But now hear, O Jacob, my servant, Israel, whom I have chosen. Isaiah 49:3. And he said to me, You are my servant Israel, in whom I will be glorified. The servant in Isaiah is called Israel by name multiple times in the surrounding chapters. The Jewish reading says that the singular pronoun in Isaiah 53 refers to the same servant who has been explicitly identified throughout the surrounding chapters as the nation. The Christian reading individuates the servant and identifies him with Jesus. The Jewish reading maintains the collective identification that the surrounding context provides. Neither reading is obviously wrong on purely textual grounds, and the debate between them is one of the most sustained and most sophisticated in the entire history of biblical interpretation. The sixth reason is about the nature of the Messiah. The Jewish tradition, drawing on the prophetic literature, understands the Messiah as a human being, a great human being, a king in the tradition of David, a teacher in the tradition of Moses, a figure of extraordinary righteousness and spiritual insight, but a human being, not divine, not pre-existent, not the second person of a Trinity. The Christian doctrine of the incarnation, the claim that Jesus was fully divine and fully human, that he was the eternal Son of God who had existed before creation and who became flesh, is from the perspective of the Jewish tradition, not merely a theological error, but a violation of the most fundamental principle of Jewish theology, the absolute unity and uniqueness of God. The Shema, the central declaration of Jewish faith. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. The Hebrew word for one in this context, echad, has been the subject of extensive theological analysis. The Jewish tradition has consistently understood it as affirming the absolute oneness of God, incompatible with any division of the divine being into persons. The Christian doctrine of the Trinity, whatever its internal theological sophistication, appears from within the Jewish theological framework as a form of polytheism, a violation of the monotheism that is the foundation of everything the Hebrew prophets proclaimed. This is not a minor disagreement. It is a disagreement about the nature of God, and the Jewish tradition holds that the Messiah, whatever else he is, must come from and represent a tradition of strict monotheism, not introduce a theological innovation that the Hebrew prophets would have recognized as incompatible with everything they proclaimed about the God of Israel. The seventh reason is the question of the oral Torah and the rabbinic tradition. Christianity, particularly in its Pauline form, developed a theology in which the Torah, the law given to Moses, had been superseded by the new covenant established by Jesus. The letter to the Galatians argues extensively that the law was a temporary measure, a guardian until Christ came, and that faith in Christ has made the law's obligations obsolete for those who are in Christ. The letter to the Hebrews argues that the Levitical priesthood and the temple sacrificial system have been superseded by the priesthood of Jesus. The Jewish tradition finds this supersessionism, the claim that the new covenant has replaced the old one, incompatible with what the Torah itself says about its own permanence. Deuteronomy 29. 29. The things that are revealed belong to us and to our children forever, that we may do all the words of this law. Deuteronomy 13, in the context of warnings about false prophets, specifies that a prophet who leads the people away from the commandments is a false prophet, regardless of whether he performs signs and wonders. The Torah presents itself as permanent, not as a temporary measure awaiting replacement. The Talmudic tradition developed the concept of the 13 principles of interpretation by which new applications of the Torah are derived, but always within the framework of the Torah's own authority. The idea that a new revelation could simply declare the Torah obsolete is, from within the rabbinic framework, precisely the kind of claim that the Torah's own warnings about false prophecy are designed to prevent. The eighth reason is what Jewish thinkers call the genealogical problem. The Gospel of Matthew begins with a genealogy of Jesus tracing his descent from David through Joseph. The Gospel of Luke provides a different genealogy, also tracing descent from David, with numerous differences from Matthew's list that biblical scholars have been arguing about for 2,000 years. The Jewish objection is straightforward. If Joseph was not the biological father of Jesus, as the virgin birth tradition claims, then Joseph's Davidic descent is irrelevant. Jesus cannot inherit the Davidic lineage through a man who was not his biological father. In the Jewish legal tradition, lineage is inherited through biological descent. An adoptive father does not transmit his tribal lineage to an adopted child in the same way that a biological father does. If Jesus was born of a virgin, with God as his father in the theological sense the Christian tradition intends, then he has no human paternal lineage to trace. And the Davidic descent required for the Messiah cannot be established through a genealogy that the tradition simultaneously claims is biologically irrelevant. The Christian tradition has developed various responses to this objection, including arguments that adoptive lineage was legally valid in first century Jewish culture, and arguments that Luke's genealogy traces the lineage of Mary rather than Joseph. These responses are contested. The Jewish tradition finds none of them fully satisfying on the terms of the internal logic of the messianic claim. The ninth reason is perhaps the most philosophically interesting and the one that is most rarely discussed in popular treatments of this question. It is the argument about the nature of prophecy and the interpretation of prophetic texts. The Christian case for Jesus as the fulfillment of messianic prophecy relies on reading specific Hebrew prophetic texts as predictions of specific events in Jesus' life. The virgin birth fulfills Isaiah 7:14. The birth in Bethlehem fulfills Micah 5-2. The entry into Jerusalem on a donkey fulfills Zechariah 9-9. The 30 pieces of silver fulfills Zechariah 11:12. The piercing of his hands and feet fulfills Psalm 22:16. The casting of lots for his garments fulfills Psalm 22:18, and so on, across dozens of cited fulfillments in the gospel texts. The Jewish objection operates on two levels. The first level is philological. Many of the prophecies that the New Testament cites as fulfilled by Jesus, when read in their original Hebrew and in their original context, do not say what the New Testament citations claim they say. The most famous example is Isaiah 7:14, cited in Matthew 1:23 as predicting the virgin birth. The Hebrew word in Isaiah 7:14 is alma, which means young woman. It does not specifically mean virgin. The word for virgin in Hebrew is betula. The Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, translated alma as parthenos, the Greek word for virgin, and it is this Greek translation that Matthew cites. The Jewish objection is that the original Hebrew text does not contain a prediction of a virgin birth. It contains a prediction about a young woman in a context that is specifically about a sign to be given to King Ahaz in the 8th century BCE, not about events 7 centuries later. The second level is contextual. When the Hebrew prophets are read in their original context rather than as a collection of predictions to be matched against later events, they are almost universally addressing specific historical situations in their own time. Isaiah is addressing the Assyrian crisis of the 8th century. Jeremiah is addressing the Babylonian crisis of the 7th and 6th centuries. The prophetic literature is not primarily a book of predictions about the distant future. It is a body of interpretation of the present, grounded in the covenant theology of ancient Israel, drawing on images and language that carry significance in their immediate historical context. The method of prophetic interpretation that the New Testament uses, reading specific phrases from the prophets as predictions of events in Jesus' life without regard to the original historical context, is a method that the Jewish tradition calls darash, a homiletical or midrashic mode of interpretation that draws out new meanings from texts without claiming to represent the text's original meaning. The Jewish objection is not that this method is illegitimate for all purposes, but that it cannot bear the weight of a claim to literal predictive fulfillment. You cannot argue that Jesus literally fulfilled the prophecies if the method you are using to establish the fulfillment is a homiletical method that does not require literal correspondence. The Jewish scholar Amy Jill Levine of Vanderbilt University, who is one of the most important voices in contemporary Jewish-Christian dialogue and who teaches New Testament at a Christian divinity school, has argued that much of the Christian engagement with Jewish messianic expectation rests on a fundamental misunderstanding of what the Jewish sources were saying. Levine has spent a career helping Christian students read Jewish texts as Jewish texts rather than as Christian predictions. And what she finds is that the gap between what the texts were saying in their original context and what Christian interpretation has made them say is considerably wider than most Christians have ever been told. Now, step back and look at the 9 arguments together. What they share is this: they are all arguments from within the text. They are not arguments that the Hebrew Bible is wrong or that the prophetic tradition is false. They are arguments that the Christian reading of the Hebrew Bible is mistaken, that the Christian interpretation of the messianic prophecies does not accurately represent what those prophecies say in Hebrew, in context, within the framework of the tradition that produced them. The Jewish response to Jesus is not primarily a refusal of faith, it is a textual argument, a claim that the evidence has been misread, that the translations are inaccurate in theologically consequential ways, that the context has been ignored, that a method of interpretation has been applied that cannot support the conclusion it is being used to reach. And it is an argument that deserves to be heard, not because it is necessarily correct, but because 2,000 years of dialogue, much of it conducted under conditions of profound inequality and danger, has produced on the Jewish side a body of theological reflection on these texts that is serious, rigorous, and largely unknown to the Christian world that the texts were supposed to be addressing. Here is the question I want to leave you with. If you had been raised in the Jewish tradition, if you had learned to read the Hebrew prophets in Hebrew from childhood, if your understanding of what the Messiah was supposed to do had been shaped by the rabbinic tradition rather than the Christian tradition, and someone came to you with the claim that Jesus of Nazareth was the fulfillment of those prophecies, what would you have said? Not with the benefit of 2,000 years of Christian theology, not with the Nicene Creed already in your hands. Just the Hebrew texts, the rabbinic tradition, and the historical facts of what Jesus did and did not accomplish. Would the 9 arguments we have examined have been convincing to you, or would something else have convinced you to look past them? Because that question, held honestly and without the pressure to reach a predetermined conclusion, is one of the most important questions in the history of Western religion. And it has been asked by millions of people across 20 centuries with answers that have split families and communities and civilizations and that continue to matter urgently and personally to billions of people alive today. The conversation is 2,000 years old. It is not over, and it has never needed honest participants more than it does now.